Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our continued training, ANHD's continued training on the basics for the Equitable Development Data Explorer and the Displacement Risk Index. I'm Alex. I'm the Senior Political Organizer at ANHD.
And I'm Abdul. I'm a graduate intern at ANHD.
So if you have been with us over the past few modules, we have covered a lot. Today, we are going to be jumping into module number 5, which is the Displacement Risk Index. The Displacement Risk Index is different than the Equitable Development Data Explorer. It's alongside it. It's at the same. It's hosted in the same place. It's part of the tool, but it has its own name and its own functions. If that is gibberish to you, if you don't know what any of those acronyms mean or what I'm talking about, definitely I would recommend that you go back and watch our previous 4 modules. In those, we covered sort of the introduction and background of why the tools even exist, how we got them, and why they matter. We covered just the very basic interface of the Equitable Development Data Explorer. What do you see when you click on the website? What do those things mean? And then we jumped into finding our community district, going through the Equitable Development Data Explorer. And in our last module, module 4, we took a deep dive onto the data. What is the data that's included in the Data Explorer tell us, and what does it look like, and how can we sort of start to understand it and move back and forth between the different views? So today, in one of our final modules, we're going to be talking about the Displacement Risk Index. We are going to start by reminding ourselves of our guiding questions. Then we are going to go through just sort of how to find our neighborhood and what is the interface of the Displacement Risk Index. And then what are the categories of the index? What do they mean? How do we sort of synthesize all that information? And also how we can look at sort of nearby neighborhoods. So with all of that said, I will take us back to our guiding questions. And we have chosen to look at, we've been looking at the neighborhood of Jackson Heights in North Corona, and as our case study for going through the tool. And the questions, the lens we've been using to look at that are, which of my neighbors are most at risk of being pushed out of our neighborhood? What's the financial situation for the majority of my neighbors? And what are some assets and resources in the neighborhood that most of my neighbors have access to? These are sort of example questions you could be applying the Equitable Development Data Explorer or the Displacement Risk Index to. So we've chosen these to kind of pick out pieces of information as we go through this training. So with all of that said, as sort of our framing and introduction for this module, I'm going to pass it over to Abdul, who's going to walk us through the actual training around the Displacement Risk Index.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. And so as Alex mentioned, we're working with the community district of Jackson Heights in North Corona. And so I'm going to share my screen and bring us back to the Equitable Development Data Explorer on the main homepage. So if you've been following along with us from module 3 and module 4, we found a way to select and find our community district, and that's in the part of Northern Queens here. So I'm just going to click it, but if you have trouble finding community district, you can go back to modules 3 and 4 to figure out how we did that here. So when you see that I click Jackson Heights in North Corona, this is on the community data view. So we aren't looking just yet at the displacement risk map and displacement risk index, but selecting it in this community view here helps us then identify the area when we switch over to the displacement risk map. When you're navigating the map, you'll see that you can move between community data here on the top left, and right next to it, displacement risk map. So when you click on that there, it changes the view of the map a little bit more. Before, when we were looking at community data, there weren't colors all over the place. But now, and I'll zoom out a little bit, the displacement risk map is formatted in a different way, both in terms of the geography and in terms of the ways that the colors coordinate to specific information that you want to know about each neighborhood. So one, in terms of the geography, you'll see that there's slightly smaller shapes and cutouts for the different areas on the map. That's because instead of looking at the community districts, they look at an even smaller level, which is the neighborhood. They pull that shape from what's called a neighborhood tabulation area, which is a way that the US Census kind of categorizes neighborhoods. And they roughly match up with how the city of New York might consider the shape and size of neighborhoods in the different boroughs. Then when you also think about the colors, you'll see on the little legend here on the bottom right that it says displacement risk map, and then it moves between highest and lowest. That highest and lowest coordinates to either highest or lowest displacement risk level. And so when you see those colors on a different geography or different neighborhood here, that's telling you what the level of displacement risk is for each of the neighborhoods. The really important thing about this tool, as we've talked about in the previous modules and as Alex shared a little bit, is that it provides us with a kind of one-stop measurement of what displacement risk looks like in the current time for an area. It's not a predictor of how many people will be displaced in an area, so you wouldn't want to treat it specifically as that, but rather it tells you what is the status of folks who are at risk, who is most vulnerable, and what's the level of that vulnerability, and how is that vulnerability for a particular population impacted by the housing market and by the larger conditions of housing in that area. So to be specific, there's 3 different data factors that are brought into how we look at the displacement risk map. And those are mentioned in the methods and sources in detail, and we'll also talk about them more here. To be able to get into them with more detail, though, I want to select the neighborhood that we want to look at for an example so you can see them in practice. So I'm going to jump real quick back to the community data view so you can see once again the area that we selected. We have Jackson Heights in North Corona. I'm going to zoom into it right here. What's really convenient about the way that the map for the EDDE is set up is that when you switch between community data and displacement risk map view, the actual frame that you're in is not going to change, and you're going to still be on top of the view that you had before. So that'll make it a little bit easier then of identifying the area where your neighborhood of interest might be. So I'm going to jump back over to displacement risk map. And when I do that, I know that this rough area here, where there's now kind of 3 or 4 blocks, is where Jackson Heights in North Corona is. So I might click around. I click this top right one. It says that it's East Elmhurst, so that's not exactly it. We want to focus on Jackson Heights for this example. Click on this one on the bottom. That's North Corona. That's part of that community district, but not what we want to look at. And then what we land on is right here, Jackson Heights. Now we'll touch on this later, but you'll notice that those 3 neighborhoods, which are part of the same community district, also have the same displacement risk level. We're going to go back and talk about those and compare them a little bit later, because just because they have the same color and level does not mean that they have the exact same situation going on for them. So the first thing that we want to do is look at the 3 different data factors that make up the displacement risk index and look at it through the example here of Jackson Heights. What you first see is that for the overall displacement risk level, Jackson Heights is rated as higher, so that's the second highest level of displacement risk that the neighborhood experiences compared to other neighborhoods and compared to the city. What's important to know about this level is that that level is determined as a comparison to the other neighborhoods that are within the city and compared to the city overall. When we then go to the specific data factors, we'll start with the population vulnerability. And population vulnerability basically focuses on different data points that tell you about the kind of economic situation and other types of identity factors that make someone more or less vulnerable to having housing instability in the current market. The specific data points that they pick for this factor is the percentage of non-white population or population of color in a space, the population who is below about 200% of the federal poverty rate, income level wise, the limited English speaking population, which is a data point that we also saw within the EDDE's tool, and then the kind of comparison of households with severe rent burden when compared to the city. You'll notice with that last factor or that last data point and some of the other ones that are shown later on with the other factors, this specifies that it's a comparison to the city rather than a comparison to the neighborhood. So then when you think about the overall level for this factor, when you think about the level of population vulnerability, you can think about that as compared to other neighborhoods, but make sure you pay attention to moments where the DRI or DRM is telling you that it's comparing to the city. In this particular instance, Jackson Heights has the highest level of risk when it comes down to population vulnerability. And this comes from how they assess that there's a high level of people of color or high percentage of people of color that live within the community, which means that they are within a population that is typically at a higher risk of displacement, and also a fairly high level of folks who are within a level of poverty and within a level of limited English speaking that is considered vulnerable. Also, the point here on households with severe rent burden, we can see that Jackson Heights has a larger percentage of severely rent burdened households when compared to the city. So that means if you remember, severely rent burdened or even extremely rent burdened are folks who are maybe paying 50% or more of their income towards their rent. So we see that that's a larger proportion when compared to the other parts of New York, or compared to New York in general. The next data factor that we want to look at is right below that, and it is the housing conditions. We can see that for Jackson Heights, that level is intermediate. The housing conditions can kind of be broadly defined as talking about the type and quality of housing that's available for residents within the neighborhood. And the 4 different data points that make up this factor include counting the housing with 3 or more maintenance deficiencies, the housing that is not income restricted and the percentage of that within the neighborhood, the kind of comparison of housing that is not rent stabilized when compared to the city, and then the percentage of renter occupied housing units. This information is really helpful because it helps us understand what housing is available to folks, particularly folks of lower income status. And when they do have that housing, or when housing is available in general, what is the quality? How well is that housing maintained? And is it maintained on a regular enough basis? So we can see that within Jackson Heights, there are fewer units with 3 or more maintenance deficiencies when compared to the city. That doesn't mean that there aren't any housing units with 3 or more maintenance deficiencies, but when you compare it to the overall, it's not as bad of a situation as the city's overall experience with this. What we also see is that there are no housing options that are income restricted, rather that there's 100% of housing that is not income restricted. However way you want to play with the negatives there, it means that there is not income restricted housing in the area. And so what that means is that there are fewer affordable housing options that typically would be available that you might see within other neighborhoods. Now, this third one is a good example of what happens when there's maybe the data is not defined enough for us to have a clear answer. It says when we talk about housing that is not rent stabilized, that there's no statistical difference in rent stabilized households compared to the city. So that might mean then that there's not like a higher or lower when compared to the city. It might be considered somewhere that's close or similar, or they might not have enough data to make that comparison in a way that is that they're statistically confident about saying. And then the last one is looking at the renter occupied housing units. We see that there's about 61% of renter occupied units, which means that's a majority renter housing neighborhood. And so this information helps us to determine what role these conditions play in the larger displacement risk level, and it's seen as intermediate or right in the middle. Then the last data factor that we're working with is the market pressure data factor, which largely focuses on data that indicates any recent changes in the demographics or cost of living within a neighborhood that makes it more or less affordable for longtime residents and for lower income residents. When we look at Jackson Heights, we see that it has the lowest level of market pressure. And once again, this is compared to other neighborhoods. The 4 data factors that make up this the 4 data points that make up this data factor are the rent change versus the city. So this is then considering like how has rent changed over time within this neighborhood when compared to how rent has changed over time in the city. When we look at this, we see that there's about an equivalent rent change to the city that's occurred within Jackson Heights, which may not be the same for other neighborhoods that have seen a lot of different developments or a lot of different people with higher or lower incomes enter their neighborhoods. The next data point is the residential property price appreciation. And so we can see that there's been an appreciation that's increased by about 3.1. And that means that there's been a property price increase in that area at a particularly, what would be seen as maybe a particularly high level when compared to some areas, but not enough to push the market pressure level that much higher besides the lowest level that it's at right now. And then we go on to seeing the bachelor degrees or higher income, which in this particular neighborhood is a smaller percentage change than the city. So there are people who have been moving or are moving in or out the neighborhood with bachelor degrees are higher, but the percentage change of people who've been moving in is not as big as what is seen at the city level. Looking at bachelor degrees or higher degree educational attainment is really helpful because that also does determine a bit about the income levels and the different kind of income status of people who are moving in or moving out of a neighborhood. And the last data point is the adjacent neighborhood pressure, which is a really helpful data point when you want to start thinking about the comparisons of neighborhoods and the experiences that they're having. In this situation, Jackson Heights does not have what is considered adjacent neighborhoods with high market pressure scores, which means that it does not have other neighborhoods nearby that are considered to be dealing with high levels of maybe developer speculation or dealing with high levels of other pressures, maybe in terms of who's moving in or the changes of rent and property prices that are occurring. So those are the three main factors in the data points that make up those factors within the displacement risk map. And what is really important is to know that you might have this data for your specific neighborhood, but it might be helpful to compare this data also to the other neighborhoods that have similar overall displacement risk levels. And so what I would suggest, especially if we're dealing with a situation like this one, where the community district of Jackson Heights in North Corona includes 3 different neighborhoods that we saw before when I was clicking around, let's just compare what those look like because they have the same overall displacement risk level. So right now we know that for Jackson Heights, the population vulnerability is at the highest level, the housing conditions are at an intermediate level, and the market pressure is at the lowest level. When I click on the right here to get to East Elmhurst, I see that their population vulnerability is at the highest level, their housing conditions is at the lower level, and their market pressure is at the lowest level. So when we compare those two, the main difference that we find is that the housing conditions are lower, while the housing conditions within Jackson Heights was intermediate. And I'll do this quick comparison to double check this. And that was the main difference between the two. But then when you look at the specific data points, there's even more specific information that makes these two places different, which helps you to understand that while these levels are really helpful to kind of define the differences of displacement risk in the neighborhoods, they still have nuances and details that you want to be aware of, just so you're not making a blanket comparison to all of these places. So for one example, the population vulnerability in East Elmhurst and the population vulnerability in Jackson Heights are both the highest. But you can see that East Elmhurst, well, Jackson Heights has about an 85% non-white population, while East Elmhurst has about a 96%. Both are high in a majority population, but East Elmhurst has an even higher percentage. So that's just important to know that they can have the same levels, but still have maybe drastically different percentages. I'll do one more comparison where we look at North Corona, which also has an overall higher level of displacement risk. But when we look at population vulnerability, it has a higher level of population vulnerability, but not the highest, which we saw for both East Elmhurst and Jackson Heights. Then the housing conditions level is intermediate, which is the same that we saw for Jackson Heights, but is a little more than what we saw for East Elmhurst. And then it shares this lowest level of vulnerability for market pressure that the other two neighborhoods have. Once again, having these comparisons can be really helpful, and it might be helpful if you wanted to interact with folks who you consider are related to you because you are in the same community district, but you have different market and housing conditions happening in your respective neighborhoods. This helps to have that conversation about what those differences or similarities are and to how to maybe think about your situations in tandem with each other if you want to work at a community district or borough level to think about affordable housing. So that is the kind of basic overview of how to use the displacement risk map and how to understand the different factors and levels that are in it. We're going to pass you on to the next module where we're going to talk more about our guiding questions and how some of what we saw in this map and in the community data view helped us answer those questions. But before you jump to that, make sure you stop at the module activity where you'll be able to practice a little bit more about looking at the map. Thanks so much.